The Imperium is overflowing with things that may be called obsolete. From sub-departments of the administratum that no longer serve any discernible purpose, to the vast forests of data stacks holding the tithe details of long-dead citizens, to the oceans of contradictory laws that is the Lex Imperialis, all the way to the very structure of imperial governance itself. There exists a wealth of protocols, technologies, and people that are simply dead weight. In a galaxy steeped in reverence for the Ancient One might think that obsolescence has no place. Yet, it is a fear of irrelevance and failure in their duties that has led many great servants of the Imperium into the very heart of darkness. Such fear is what came to define the Castellans of the Crimson Star. Once a beacon of imperial nobility, their final descent into the depths of corruption was a tragedy writ large. The Castellans of the Crimson Star were a household of imperial knights, one of the few that operated within subsector Titus, basing their great keep upon the feudal moon of Charybdis, which sat in the orbit of the Forge World Hyacinthum Fenestra. Their existence dated back as far as any record could indicate. To many, their presence was seen as one of the few constants in the chaotic tapestry that was subsector Titus. The knights themselves operated in a fairly conventional way, following a hierarchy of ranks and noble titles that echoed those seen in knightly houses across the Imperium. In battle, the knights would stride into combat within their mighty warsuits, supported by small contingents of professional retainers and flocks of their fanatic serfs at arms. The Castellans of the Crimson Star held a long and illustrious history, one filled with great sagas of victories and noble struggles. Ahead of all other concerns, they were dedicated to the defense of Hyacinthum Fenestra. Their fealty sealed both by ancient right and the need for the Forge World's expertise in maintaining their war machines. Often groups of knights and their accompanying retinues would directly garrison the planet and its holdings, or else would join the Skitarii forces to fight in battle zones across the subsector. Though this oath of allegiance supposedly placed the needs of the Castellans foremost in the priorities of the Forge World, the Castellans of the Crimson Star gradually found themselves competing for the planet's favor. Chief amongst these rivals were the roaming armies of Crusade Group 742 and, more recently, the Order of Our Lady of Perpetual Ammunition. As a powerful and rapidly growing faction within the subsector, the vast technological and logistical demands of the Order slowly began to overtake the needs of the Castellans. When the sisters declared their own oath of protection over the Forge World and established a permanent priory keep upon its surface, this slight upon the honor of the Castellans was taken to heart. Though proud and ancient, by the latter centuries of the 41st millennium, the Castellans found themselves stagnating. Their duties to Hyacinthum Fenestra soon left them outstripped in wartime glories, whilst their steeping in ancient protocol left them lacking in the political expertise needed to survive within the modern subsector Titus. As the final centuries of that dread millennium drew to a close, the Castellans of the Crimson Star discovered that they had become a waning strength. Ultimately, it was the fear of this weakness that opened the way for their downfall. It is unknown when exactly the first tendrils of corruption found their way into the Castellans' household, but it seems certain that the door was opened by its leadership. From the testimony of one of their few loyalist knights, we can deduce that a cult of ruin had taken hold of the house's highest nobles. Dedicated to the praise of chaos undivided, but with a particular focus on the worship of Nurgle, it seems that a bargain was struck with some demonic entity that would allow the Castellans of the Crimson Star to endure this wave of upstarts that sought to topple them from their place of glory. Curiously, the influence of this cult never seemed to spread to the lower ranks of knights. Upon reflection, it is clear that this was due to the work of another cult that had already swept through the house's lower members. The Scions of the Eye were a splinter group of a larger gene-stealer cult that had long since plagued subsector Titus. How this Xenos strain found its way into the household is unclear. Perhaps a wounded knight was implanted upon the battlefield, or perhaps they were undermined within the keep itself. Maybe some secretive emissary approached these lower-born nobles and offered them power in exchange for their souls. Whatever their cause, the cult found a strong root within these knights, converting a huge portion of their kin and almost the entirety of their retainers, as well as large swathes of the feudal population of Charybdis itself. Precisely how the cults discovered each other's existence is a mystery lost to Imperial knowledge. One can imagine a protracted war in the shadows as these divided loyalties drove a knife through the house, each side seeking to undermine the other, whilst desperate to keep the truth of their fall from the many eyes of Subsector Titus. Precisely what manner of clandestine warfare was conducted can only be guessed at, and indeed the number of quote-unquote technical failures and so-called friendly fire incidents that proliferated the deployments of the Castellans throughout latter M41 seem now to have a far more telling cause. Regardless, it is believed that both of these cults festered for at least a century before the masquerade the house presented to the subsector finally broke and a great schism tore it in two. As the 41st millennium neared its final century, the Castellans of the Crimson Star seemed to all the subsector to descend into madness. Weapons were turned upon each other as night fought night, crushing the hapless soldiers between them almost as an afterthought. On battlefields and garrison worlds, from one side of the subsector to the other, advancing armies and crusades ground to a halt as their much-needed heavy support either quit the fight entirely or paused to cannibalize their erstwhile comrades. Upon Hyacinth and Fenestra herself, the fighting was only all the more maddening. Thanks to their ancient position as guardians, the knights and their retainers held strategically vital positions all across the world. These great bastions were soon reduced to bloody melees, whilst the knights dueled each other in the industrial sprawl. Fortresses disappeared in great plumes of fire and radiation, as saboteurs from each cult sought to cripple the other and deny them any strategic advantage. The loyalist forces upon Hyacinth and Fenestra were caught amidst it all, with maniples of Skitari annihilated in the packed streets and wide plains of the world before they could intervene. The Sisters of Our Lady of Perpetual Ammunition in particular suffered heavily, being one of the few targets that both cults were willing to unite against, and their first priory keep on the world was annihilated in a tide of fire before the knights once again turned upon each other. The Moon of Charybdis fared little better, as both cults had long since been gathering their power there in secret. Though the vast keep of the Castellans fell quickly to the control of the Chaos Cultists, the wide marshland and tall mountains of the world belonged firmly to the Gene Stealers. With the majority of the world's peasantry corrupted to their insidious cause, a vast host of commoners was raised to bloody the walls of the keep. In a long and protracted siege, the ancient fortress was assailed again and again, all whilst each side gradually called in more of their forces from across the subsector. These reinforcements made war both upon Charybdis and Hyacinth and Fenestra, forcing yet more suffering onto the beleaguered Forge world. Ammunition stores, assembly silos, even the great manufactoria were torn to shreds in a desperate frenzy to secure the weapons, fuel, and supplies that would decide the ultimate victor. Eventually, this eternal feud drew away enough of the knight's strength that a counter-assault could be planned. The Skitari and remaining Sisters upon the Forge world led an attack to secure its orbital ring, retaking the naval defenses and opening the way for a full assault upon Charybdis. Knowing that their homeworld was lost, the knights made their final desperate attempts to secure assets before quitting the world. In the madness of the final scramble, their great keep was reduced to a blasted ruin, whilst the lands all around it burned. The remains of the house's former leadership were some of the first to flee, using a flotilla of ships stolen from the Forge world's orbital ring to retreat into the warp. With them came the vast armory of their keep, with many scores of knights and all the resources needed to keep them in fighting condition. With these riches, they sought sanctuary with the Brotherhood of Rust, pledging their allegiance to the traitors that held a string of hardened fortress worlds along the edge of the subsector. By the skill of their warpsmiths and demonic forges, the knights were restored, reaching even greater heights of power than before. They soon became a common terror found on battlefields across the subsector, devoted wholly to the cause of the Brotherhood of Rust and carrying its putrefied banner until the subsector's calamitous end. Those knights who had pledged themselves to the cause of the Gene Stealers escaped with the assistance of a group of pirates, spiriting them away from Charybdis in exchange for a promise of service. Taking with them far fewer knights, and with scarcely the necessary resources to maintain them, their only remaining strength lay with their vast host of Gene Stealer cultists. Through sheer numbers, they overwhelmed their saviors, corrupting them and swelling their ranks further. These cultists spent the next few decades slowly spreading the gene-stealer infection to other pirate groups, building up a vast fleet of ships and countless hundreds of thousands of crew. With such an influx of souls, the Magi and Patriarch of the cult swelled with power, able to control ever larger hordes of thralls and shining their psychic beacon all the stronger into the void. The terror of these corsairs became legendary throughout the subsector, allowing the remaining knights to throw off their previous titles and birthing the dreaded Red Castellans. Whilst those who joined with the forces of chaos have long since lost their identities to the soulless war machine that is the Brotherhood of Rust, it is with this fleet of half-Xenos monsters that the final chapter of the Castellans of the Crimson Star can be found. From the records of worker revolts and systematic purges that continue to burden Hyacinth and Fenestra during its final days, we can determine that a large portion of the cult's followers were left on the Forge World during their retreat. These forces seeded the Undercity and the wilds of the planet, growing stronger in the darkness and laying the groundwork for its eventual fall. This would come many decades later, as the final days of the 41st millennium came to a bitter crescendo. Hyacinth and Fenestra herself is known to have suffered some kind of mass revolt, one that required the full deployment of its Skitarii garrison and nearly 400 Sisters of Our Lady of Perpetual Ammunition. Shortly after this, all communications with the Forge World ceased, with hastily declared inquisitorial sanctions quarantining the planet and all its sector-wide holdings. From the recovered distress calls of a merchant flotilla that was trapped within the system, we know that a vast armada was making its way towards the world, each vessel bearing the broken crimson shield of the Red Castellans. Considering that a splinter fleet of Tyranid bioships are known to have followed this initial assault, the truth of the matter seems clear. The Red Castellans had returned to Hyacinth and Fenestra, ready to reap their vengeance upon the world that would have discarded them as obsolete, and their vile masters soon followed. As is often the case, the opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum denies us all further knowledge of the fate of both Hyacinth and Fenestra and the Red Castellans. The warp storms that tore Subsector Titus to shreds during this calamitous time would have doubtlessly put paid to any forces left in the void. As for any soul still alive in its worlds, the faltering shadow in the warp that has hung like a pall over the Hyacinthum system ever since suggests one particularly certain fate. Concerning the holdings of the Brotherhood of Rust, it is known that the greatest soul to break this nexus of corruption failed with the fall of Cadia, as the last gathered forces of the subsector shattered upon the unyielding walls of the archenemy. Those knights who stood atop the decayed ramparts of these worlds may still be there today, their corrupted forms denying them the release of death in favor of the twisted endurance that was promised. To any poor soul that still persists within Subsector Titus, spotting a knight will no doubt be more cause for dread than for hope. No longer the towering paragons of imperial nobility, any that remain in this cursed corner of space must be vile, twisted things, grown fat from the misery that assails mankind. If any such sight is to be seen, then it is surely the last detestable remnants of a once mighty house, brought low by fear and falter.